There's a rather glaring sense of irony in a duo of mid-70-year-olds releasing an album entitled Who in 2019's musical landscape. Nevertheless, there is at least some hype for this album amongst fans of classic rock legends The Who, especially since this is their first release of original material since 2006's Endless Wire. To add to this hype, vocalist Roger Daltrey has even stated that he thinks this new album is the band's finest work since 1973's Quadrophenia. So do The Who manage to capture the spirit of their earlier body of work without letting the bitter sting of age impact their performances? Let's get into my review. So The Who is like barely a band. After the deaths of Keith Moon and John Entwistle, 2006 marked the band's first album of new material since 1982. I remember passing on seeing The Who's show in 2007 because I was a teenager saving money to see Rush twice. Since then, the band's been touring rather extensively without releasing any new material, which kind of adds to the sense that The Who feels more like a touring nostalgic act rather than a proper band. Pete and Roger are really the only credited members of the band, despite having very notable and talented rhythm section. The duo also recorded their parts on this album separately, so going into this album, everything just kind of screamed disjointed, forced, cash grab, inauthentic, not really a real album from a real band. Until you listen to the album. I wouldn't use any of those descriptors to describe my thoughts on this album, but before getting into the actual sound of the album, I have to say just how much I love the album artwork. I would totally just buy this album on vinyl, frame it, and then just display it on my wall, and that's before even having heard the album. I just love how the artwork is this sort of cultural mosaic of all these awesome things, including Batman and Robin. Getting into the album opener, All This Music Must Fade listens as this sort of meta, self-aware reflection on The Who releasing new music in 2019. Lyrically, we're hearing that the band is sort of aware that their music isn't going to blow the pants off of anyone, and everything we kind of are hearing has already sort of been said in one form or another by somebody at some point. It's really interesting commentary on intellectual property and the evolution of music, which I don't know was their intention here, but I really dug it. I also love the way the drums drop tempo as the pre-chorus begins and the backing vocals in the chorus. This track had a very classic Who vibe to it, and I feel like it really stands up against some of their famous tracks and starts the album off really strong. Interestingly enough, Roger Daltrey has stated that one of the demos Pete sent him involved rapping that Roger was not impressed with and suggested that they let the youngsters wear those clothes. I think this comment shows a level of self-awareness that The Who really has no business evolving or changing their sound this late in their career. Instead, they should really just be focusing on delivering things that sound fresh but still containing elements of their classic sound. Having said that, I am curious what a 75-year-old who spent his entire career not rapping would sound like rapping. Can't put me in a home, leave me alone, don't have Snapchat on my phone. Ball and Chain is a reworked version of Pete Townshend's Guantanamo from 2015. The reworked version is still a simple but effective 12-bar blues tune with classic Who elements like an arpeggiated piano intro and dramatic layered guitars that come in rather suddenly. I much prefer Roger's voice in general to Pete's, and the instrumental layers and repeated piano or arpeggio theme are much more interesting than the original cut. There's also some really cool guitar work at the end that stands out on this album as one of the only real guitar solos, which I find really strange. Don't Want to Get Wise lyrically feels like a spiritual successor to My Generation. There's even a stutter as Roger sings snotty young kids. Sorry, that was more of a James from Metallica. The vocoder effect in the chorus also really adds some personality to the track that I really didn't see coming the first time I heard this song. The next track, Detour, really stands out as a highlight on this album for me. Roger's voice is strong and gritty on this track, and really just throughout the album in general. Longtime touring member and studio musician Pino Palladino really shines on bass here, and there's some subtle funk guitar in the breakdowns. This track really just sold me on the idea that this is an album by a band and not just a duo. The middle of the album starts to lose some of the up-tempo rock momentum with Beads on a String, which is really kind of a good thing. It's nice to have ballad-esque songs for contrast. This track begins with an interesting synth melody with rolling drums that propel this into a feel-good ballad with a really strong chorus and an effective metaphor. There are really strong vocal performances throughout and really interesting instrumentation that make this a standout track for me. Hero Ground Zero begins with an orchestral vibe similar to that of Love Reign O'er Me without the I found the chorus catchy enough, and there's some really neat drum and guitar work that make for a really dynamic listen that will probably please Who fans. Street Song took a few listens for me to fully appreciate. There's less setting this song apart from the rest of the tracks on the album, but there are some really cool backing vocals and interesting enough instrumentation stretches that it is worth digging into. I don't really know what to say about the track I'll Be Back. Pete's voice definitely hasn't aged as nicely as Roger's has. At times he kind of even sounds like a Muppet singing an awkward love song. This song's probably the most interesting musically on the album, ranging from impressive harmonica work to a really jarring and eyebrow-raising rap breakdown, but it makes for a really weird listen overall. Break the News is probably my least favorite track on this album. It kind of feels like a knockoff of pretty much any typical folk millennial tune you hear on the radio. Think like the worst of Mumford & Sons, ranging to that really annoying Home song from the American Idol guy. There are some nice melodies throughout, but overall the chord progression is super generic and just really weak sounding. Despite the name of the track, Rockin' in Rage is kind of a bland, generic feeling rocker with a minor peep of a guitar solo. And the song She Rocked My World is neat instrumentally with Latin-infused guitar work, but it's weak lyrically and vocally, and it just doesn't really work as a closer. Overall, the album performs the impressive task of sounding fresh and interesting from a band who's been fragmented, inactive, and dated by the evolution of music. But on a track-by-track basis, only about half of the album is really strong. There's a lot here that will keep me coming back listening, but there's also a lot of weaker, kind of boring, almost lifeless tracks that really sag the momentum built up by the midpoint of the album. After a full listen of this album, it also dawned at me that this very well might be the final proper Who album. With Pete and Roger in their mid-70s, it seems rather unlikely that they'll release anything new under the Who banner in the next few years. So with that context in mind, would fans be happy if this was the final album from The Who? I think you could take the best tracks from Endless Wire and the standout tracks here and combine them to make a really solid listening experience, but I'm torn between seeing this album as a fresh yet classic sounding Who album that also contains quite a few tracks that really weaken the album overall. So for that reason, I'd probably give this album like a 3 out of 5. What do you guys think? Share your thoughts in the comments and try to keep it about music, because I know Pete Townshend's done some really weird things in the last few years, and I just don't really want to talk about that.
Who knew that The Who had a new album they call Who? Click below for another review.